All right, so you know how it is nowadays, right? Open your phone and boom, it's just an absolute deluge of headlines, all screaming for your attention, each one promising some like earth-shattering revelation, and you're just left there like, what do I even need to know here?
Yeah, totally. It's like this constant fire hose of information coming at us online. And it can be so overwhelming trying to sift through it all and just find what actually matters.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, that feeling of like information overload is exactly why we do this show, right?
Mhm.
You bring the sources and we dive in deep and pull out the juicy bits so you don't have to.
Exactly.
So today we're taking a deep dive into something that I'm sure everyone listening has encountered at some point online, and that is clickbait.
Clickbait.
You know those headlines that are so like irresistible that you just can't help but click on them, even if you know deep down that they're probably going to lead to something a lot less exciting than they promise?
Oh, yeah. We've all fallen for it at some point.
Yeah.
It's that curiosity gap that really gets you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to help us understand the mechanics of clickbait, we're going to be looking at a research paper titled Pragmatic Mechanisms of Manipulation in Russian Online Media: How Clickbait Works or Does Not.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look into the linguistic and psychological tricks that these headlines use to grab our attention. So our mission today is threefold. First, we want to define what exactly clickbait is, get a clear understanding what we're dealing with here. Second, we're going to explore how clickbait works, what are the specific linguistic and psychological techniques that make it so effective. And then finally, we want to see whether clickbait is always a guaranteed win for getting those clicks. Is it really as effective as everyone seems to think it is?
Sounds good to me.
All right, so let's start by defining our terms here. How did the researchers in this paper define clickbait?
Well, they define clickbait as ambiguous, misleading headlines aimed at exploiting readers' curiosity gap. And I think the key word there is ambiguous.
Ambiguous? Okay.
Yeah, because these headlines, they were designed to sort of suggest one interpretation right, which is often something really like sensational or shocking. But that interpretation turns out to be like false, or at least like heavily exaggerated. And then there's like another interpretation that's kind of hidden beneath the surface that's more accurate, but it's a lot less obvious. And you only really get that once you've already clicked through and read the article.
So it's like they're dangling this really juicy piece of information in front of you, but then when you actually bite into it, it's like, oh, that's not what I was expecting at all.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about creating that initial sense of intrigue and then kind of pulling the rug out from under you once you've already committed to reading.
Gotcha. And the researchers found that this kind of bait and switch tactic is often achieved through something called a false generalized conversational implicature, or a GCI for short.
Right.
So can you break that down for us a little bit? What is a GCI and how does it become false in the context of clickbait?
Okay, so imagine you're having a conversation with someone, right?
Hmm.
And you're both kind of following these unspoken rules of communication, like you're both trying to be truthful and relevant, and you're giving each other enough information to understand what you're talking about without like overwhelming each other with unnecessary details.
Wait, we do that all the time without even thinking about it.
Exactly. And these unspoken rules, they're called cooperative maxims. And they were first outlined by a linguist named Paul Grice.
Okay.
And there are like four main maxims. There's the maxim of quantity, which means like give enough information but not too much. There's quality, which is all about being truthful. There's relevance, so staying on topic. And then there's manner, which is about being clear and avoiding ambiguity.
So basically just being a good conversational partner.
Exactly. But clickbait headlines, they often deliberately violate or flout these maxims in order to create that sense of intrigue and get you to click.
So they're breaking the rules of polite conversation.
In a way, yes. Like, they might not give you enough information to fully understand what's going on, which violates the maxim of quantity, or they might use language that's really vague or ambiguous, which violates manner, or they might strongly imply something that isn't quite true, which kind of edges towards a violation of quality, although it's usually done in a way that's not explicitly dishonest.
Right, so it's not outright lying, but it's definitely bending the truth a little bit.
Exactly, and that's where the false GCIs come in. The headline makes you assume something without actually stating it directly, and then when you read the article, that assumption turns out to be false, or at least misleading.
Okay, so it's all about creating these unspoken assumptions in the reader's mind that then turn out to be not quite right.
Exactly.
And the researchers in this paper, they identified several different types of false GCIs that are commonly used in Russian online media.
Right.
So let's take a look at some of those. What's the first type of false GCI that they identified?
Okay, so the first type is what they call false cause-effect inference.
False cause and effect. Okay.
Yeah, and this basically plays on our natural tendency to look for connections between events, right?
Yeah.
Like if something happens, we want to know why it happened. So these headlines, they often leave out the explicit reason why something happened, and that leads us to assume a reason based on the other information that's presented. And of course, that assumed reason usually turns out to be false.
So they're leaving out a crucial piece of the puzzle and letting our brains fill in the blank with something that's more exciting than the reality.
Exactly.
Do you have an example of a headline that uses this false cause-effect technique?
Yeah, they gave a really good example. Putin awarded the Croatian soccer player who shouted, "Glory to Ukraine."
Oh, wow. That's a loaded headline, especially given the whole Russia-Ukraine situation.
Right, and the first thing that probably pops into your head when you read that is that Putin gave the player an award because he shouted this pro-Ukraine slogan.
Right, like maybe he was trying to make some kind of political statement or something.
Exactly. But when you actually read the article, you find out that the Croatian player was actually awarded for winning the silver medal at the FIFA World Cup, which was hosted in Russia.
Oh, so the whole glory to Ukraine thing was just a coincidence.
Yeah, pretty much. It was just a random detail that was thrown in there to create this false connection in our minds.
Wow, that's sneaky. So they're exploiting our tendency to jump to conclusions and make assumptions about people's motivations, even when there's no real evidence to support those assumptions.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's false cause and effect. What's the next type of false GCI?
The next category is false factuality and actuality inferences.
False factuality and actuality. Okay, so what does that mean?
So this one often involves the use of ambiguous language, particularly with verbs that have to do with speaking or communicating.
Okay, so like verbs like said or announced or told.
Exactly. And in Russian, they found that this construction, X raskazal ob y, which translates to X told about Y, was often used in clickbait headlines. And the ambiguity here lies in what Y actually refers to. Is it the general topic of conversation, or is it the specific content or news being conveyed?
So it's like saying, I told you about the weather versus I told you that it's going to rain.
Yeah, exactly. And the clickbait headlines, they often use this ambiguity to create a false sense of factuality. Like, they'll imply that something concrete has happened, when in reality, the article is just talking about the possibility of something happening.
Okay, so can you give us an example of how this works in practice?
Yeah, sure. They gave this example. France spoke about lifting EU sanctions against Russia.
Oh, wow, that sounds like a big deal.
Right. Like, at first glance, you might think that France has announced that they're going to lift sanctions against Russia.
Right.
But when you read the article, you find out that France has merely discussed the possibility of lifting sanctions at some point in the future. Or maybe they've just outlined the conditions under which they might consider lifting sanctions.
So they're just talking about it. They haven't actually done anything yet.
Exactly. But the headline makes it sound like something concrete is happening.
It's like they're playing on our desire for things to change or for things to happen quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And they also found that this category includes what they call actuality inferences.
Actuality inferences.
Yeah, and this basically involves using specific verb forms that imply that an action has been completed and is like relevant to the present moment.
Okay.
So they might use these verbs to suggest that something has just happened when in reality the event happened a long time ago, or it's not really relevant to the present situation.
So they're making old news seem new again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They gave an example about the figure skater Alina Zagitova and how a clickbait headline might say something like, Zagitova spoke about leaving figure skating for another sport, which makes it sound like she's recently made a major career change.
Right.
But when you read the article, you find out that she actually switched to gymnastics for a short period when she was a child.
Oh, wow. So they're taking something from her past and making it seem like it's happening now. That's pretty misleading. Okay, so we've got false cause and effect and false factuality and actuality inferences. What's the next category?
Okay, so the next one is false universality inference.
False universality.
Okay, and this occurs when a headline uses generic plural noun phrases without any specific quantifiers.
Okay, can you give us an example of what that means?
Yeah, sure. So a headline might say something like, Russians will stop supplying meter readings.
Okay.
And the natural inference here is that all Russians, or at least a very large portion of them, will no longer have to submit their utility meter readings.
Right, like it's a blanket statement that applies to everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you read the article, you find out that this change only applies to people who live in newly constructed buildings that have automatic meter reading systems.
Oh, so it's a much smaller group of people than the headline makes it seem.
Exactly. And the study found that this was a really common technique in Russian online media. Yeah, like 77 out of 100 headlines from two popular news websites, lenta.uu and Redis, that use this kind of generic plural noun phrase turned out to be clickbait.
Wow, that's a pretty high percentage. So that they're using these broad generalizations to make it seem like something is a much bigger deal than it actually is.
Exactly.
Okay, what's next?
All right, so the next category is false quality inference.
False quality.
Yeah, and this often involves using verbs that describe skills or abilities or evaluations without any modifying words that would give a more accurate picture of the situation.
So like saying speak without specifying how well someone speaks a language, or saying assess without saying whether the assessment was positive or negative.
Exactly. So, for example, a headline might say, Ronaldo switched to speaking Russian.
Okay.
And the immediate implication is that Ronaldo has become fluent in Russian.
Right. That would be pretty impressive.
Yeah, but when you read the article, you find out that he just said a few basic phrases in Russian during an Instagram live stream.
All right, so they're making a big deal out of nothing.
Yeah, basically. And they found similar examples with other celebrities and athletes, headlines that made it seem like they were doing something much more impressive than they actually were.
So it's all about exaggerating people's skills or abilities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also found examples of headlines that use this technique to create false impressions about evaluations or assessments. Like there was one headline that said, Russia assessed appreciated the idea to make a movie about the Skripal's poisoning.
Okay.
And that headline makes it sound like Russia is in favor of the idea of making a movie about the Skripals.
Right.
But when you read the article, you find out that Russia actually had a lot of concerns and criticisms about the idea.
So the headline is completely misrepresenting Russia's stance on the issue.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's false quality inference. What's next?
Okay, so the next one is false referential inference.
False referential inference. What's that all about?
So this one plays on ambiguity in how we refer to things. Like sometimes there's confusion between a name and what it actually refers to.
Okay, can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, sure. So one example they gave was, they will stop selling table salt in Russia.
What?
Yeah, I know, right? Sounds crazy.
Like no more salt.
Exactly. That's what the headline wants you to think.
Yeah.
But when you read the article, you find out that due to a new regulation, table salt will now be referred to as edible salt.
Oh, so it's just a name change.
Yeah, exactly. But the headline exploits the ambiguity of the term table salt. Like, are we talking about the chemical compound itself, or are we talking about the specific name that it's sold under?
Right, I see. So it's a technicality that they're using to create a sense of panic or alarm.
Exactly. And they also found this with place names. Like, there was a headline that said, Astana is no more, which makes it sound like the city has disappeared.
Right.
But it turns out that the city was just renamed Nur-Sultan.
Oh, okay.
And then another type of referential ambiguity that they found was due to the absence of possessive expressions.
Possessive expressions like his or her or its.
Exactly. So, for example, a headline might say, dozens of passengers were kicked out of the plane because of excess weight.
Okay.
And the natural assumption is that the passengers were overweight.
Right.
But when you read the article, you find out that the plane itself was overweight, and they had to remove some passengers to reduce the weight.
Oh, so they left out the word its, and that completely changed the meaning of the sentence.
Exactly.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
pretty clever. So they're using these subtle grammatical tricks to mislead us.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's false referential inference. Are there any other types of false GCIs that we need to be aware of?
Yeah. They also mentioned a category called other false inferences, which basically covers any other type of ambiguity that can be used to create a misleading headline.
Okay.
And one common example of this is lexical ambiguity, which is when a word has multiple meanings.
Right, like the word bank can refer to a financial institution or the edge of a river.
Exactly. And clickbait headlines, they often exploit these multiple meanings to create a more sensational or intriguing interpretation.
So can you give us an example of a clickbait headline that uses lexical ambiguity?
Yeah, they gave this example. Kirkorov and Pugacheva reunited after their divorce.
Oh, wow, that's juicy.
Right. Like, if you're familiar with these two Russian pop stars, you'd probably assume that they've gotten back together romantically.
Right.
But when you read the article, you find out that they just met at a music festival.
Oh, so they're not back together.
Nope. But the headline uses the word reunited, which can have multiple meanings. Like it can mean to reestablish a romantic relationship, or it can just mean to come together again in the same space.
Right, so they're using the more sensational meaning of the word to get us to click.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Oh, that's a lot to keep track of. But I think the main takeaway here is that clickbait headlines are often designed to mislead us by creating false impressions and assumptions.
Exactly.
So now that we have a good understanding of how clickbait works, let's talk about its effectiveness. Does clickbait actually work? Like, do these linguistic tricks actually lead to more clicks?
Well, to answer that question, the researchers conducted an online experiment with over 1,000 participants.
Okay.
And in this experiment, they presented participants with pairs of headlines for the same news story. One headline was honest and straightforward, and the other headline used clickbait techniques.
Okay.
And then they tracked which headlines people were more likely to click on.
And what do they find?
Well, they found that the clickbait headlines did indeed receive significantly more clicks than the honest headlines.
Really?
Yeah, so it seems that in general, these techniques are pretty effective at getting people to click.
But you mentioned earlier that the effectiveness of clickbait isn't uniform.
Right.
So in what situations does it seem to fall short or not be as successful?
Well, what they found was that the success of clickbait isn't just about the linguistic tricks that we've been talking about.
Okay.
There are also these broader pragmatic factors that come into play, like the inherent level of interest in the news topic itself and the perceived impact of the topic on the public.
So like a boring news story can't be magically transformed into a clickbait sensation just by using a clever headline.
Exactly. What they found was that clickbait is most effective when it can elevate a topic that might not be inherently engaging by exaggerating its potential audience or its perceived level of impact.
Okay, so can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, sure. So when they looked at headlines concerning sanctions against Russia, they found that the clickbait headlines only resulted in a relatively small increase in clicks compared to the honest headlines.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's probably because sanctions against Russia are already a topic of considerable interest and importance to a lot of people. So the clickbait headlines didn't really add much to the equation.
Right, if people are already interested in the topic, they're going to click on it regardless of how the headline is phrased.
Exactly. But on the other hand, when it comes to topics that have universal relevance, things that could potentially affect everyone, they found that clickbait that was too outlandish or implausible could actually backfire.
Okay, so like what kind of headlines are we talking about here?
Well, they gave some examples like a supposed ban on burying the dead in China, or the idea of Ronaldo suddenly speaking fluent Russian.
Okay, yeah, those are pretty far-fetched.
Right. Like they're so obviously unrealistic that they actually ended up getting fewer clicks than the honest headline.
So there's a limit to how much you can stretch the truth even with clickbait.
Exactly. But where clickbait really seemed to shine was in boosting news stories that might otherwise go unnoticed.
Okay, so stories that aren't inherently interesting to a broad audience.
Exactly. Like they found that by using clickbait techniques to exaggerate the potential impact of a story, they could get a lot more people to click on it.
So can you give us some example of that?
Yeah, sure. So one example they gave was a headline that suggested that a famous soccer player had renounced his Russian citizenship.
Okay.
And that headline got a lot more clicks than the honest headline, which just stated that the player was considering renouncing his citizenship.
So they took something that was just a possibility and made it seem like it was a done deal.
Exactly. And they found similar results with other headlines that exaggerated the impact of a story, like a headline that implied that all Russians would receive free public transportation.
Okay, so they're basically making a mountain out of a molehill.
Exactly. But they also found that clickbait wasn't very effective for highly specialized topics with a very narrow audience.
Okay.
Like they gave an example of a news story about a specific Russian politician who's not very well known outside of Russia.
Okay.
And they found that the clickbait headline for that story didn't get any more clicks than the honest headline.
So basically, if people aren't already interested in the topic, clickbait isn't going to make them interested.
Exactly.
Okay, so it seems like the effectiveness of clickbait really depends on a lot of different factors.
It does.
Like the topic of the story, the target audience, and how believable the exaggeration is.
Right.
So the researchers, they also briefly touched on why clickbait might be so widespread despite its often misleading nature.
They did.
And what did they say about that?
Well, they pointed to the mixed truth status of these false implicatures that we've been talking about.
Okay.
Because the misleading implications are ultimately canceled out by the content of the article. Journalists and media outlets can kind of argue that they're not engaging in outright lying.
Right, so it's like they're towing the line, but not quite crossing it.
Exactly. And that might be one reason why clickbait is so prevalent in online media.
Interesting. So it's not technically false, but it's definitely misleading. Well, this has been a really enlightening look into the world of clickbait.
It has.
So to wrap things up, can you give our listeners a quick summary of the key takeaways from this deep dive?
Yeah, sure. So I think the most important thing to remember is that clickbait often functions by using subtle linguistic manipulation to create false implications and spark your curiosity.
Right.
And while it's often effective at generating clicks, it's not a foolproof strategy.
Okay.
Its success really depends on the underlying news topic and how believable the exaggeration in the headline is.
Right.
So by understanding these techniques, you can become a more savvy consumer of online news and avoid falling for these misleading headlines.
Exactly. And just by being aware of these techniques, you can start to notice when a headline is trying to trick you into clicking on it.
Right.
So as you're scrolling through your news feeds today, pay attention to the headlines that really grab your attention.
Yes.
Are they promising something that sounds too good to be true?
Right.
Are they creating a sense of urgency or mystery without giving you enough real information?
Exactly.
If so, there's a good chance that you're dealing with clickbait.
Right.
And by recognizing these tactics, you can make more informed decisions about which headlines you click on and what information you choose to believe.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder.
Okay.
Now that you're aware of these clickbait techniques, how do you think this knowledge will change the way you interact with online media? Will you be more skeptical of those attention-grabbing headlines?
Maybe.
Will you be more likely to check the source of a story before you share it on social media? It's definitely something to think about. And as always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of online media.
You're welcome.
We hope you found it informative, and we encourage you to keep these ideas in mind as you continue to explore the vast and often bewildering world of online information.
Absolutely.
Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.